Well, hello there. Brent here with Bring Your Own Tools, and on today's episode, if you want to see how I made this one-of-kind accent wall for my son, keep on watching. Let's get started.
With any good accent wall project, it all starts with a blank canvas, and in order to do that, I always suggest taking off any electrical outlet plate covers along with the wall base underneath it. Now, you certainly don't have to take the wall base off, but on this application and on this unique accent wall, we wanted to replace the wall base with something a little bit more special than primed MDF. Once the wall base was removed, I then cleaned up any excess caulk that was laying on the floor, as well as filling any holes that are in the wall prior to application of wallpaper.
My BYOT t-shirts might always be black, but I love myself some floral print, and this one from Next Wall was one of the best looking floral prints I saw. There's a number of them out there that are available on the Lowe's website, but I personally think this is going to add a lot of character to the entire room, and I can't wait to see what it looks like when it's actually installed. But first things first, we need to do a bit of measuring.
I quickly take the measurement from the very bottom of the floor to the top of the ceiling and add about 4 inches. Now, I do account for the fact that we have wall base here, so I don't have to go all the way down to the floor either. So this basically gives me a full 8 inches of excess, which gives us plenty of wiggle room as we apply our first row. Our wallpaper is 20.5 inches wide, and I find the easiest way to install the very first roll of wallpaper perfectly straight was to bring in a laser level. Now, I align the laser level perfectly with my mark on the wall, and that gives me a very clear distinction on where my first row needs to be perfectly placed. One thing to keep in mind also is that my mark on the wall is at 20 inches, not 20.5 inches. And that's because I want an excess ½ inch on the opposite side of the wall, so I can cut that excess off perfectly when the time comes. This provides a very handy way of getting a perfect seam on both sides of your wall, even if the inside or outside corner of your wall isn't perfectly straight. As for the wallpaper itself, as I mentioned earlier, I did pick this up at Lowe's.com, and it's called out as Next Wall Ebony Vinyl Floral Self-Adhesive Peel and Stick Wallpaper. It's a mouthful, but it's certainly a beautiful color, a beautiful quality, and it's a vinyl print, which means it's extremely easy to apply, but it's also very easy to remove if you ever want to remove it down the line. And as someone who has spent countless hours removing old wallpaper from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and so forth, I assure you that was painstakingly difficult and time consuming, but with this product, I'm not opposed to actually applying wallpaper if it's so easily able to remove it. And why do I say that? Well, my son might not be super into Hawaiian floral print like his dad is, so I want to make sure that if I do have to remove this down the line, we're easily able to and we're not trying to pull out our hair doing so. As I finish up this first row, you do quickly realize that it's much easier to work in smaller sections with vinyl print. It might not permanently stick to everything, but it is sticky, so working in small sections is always advisable with vinyl wallpaper. And if you're wondering yourself, what is this unique contraption and tool that I'm using to apply the wallpaper, it's my favorite hidden gem when applying any wallpaper, whether it's vinyl or anything else. It's called a textured paint spatula, and the really nice key element of this product is that it's a stiff plastic, but it also has a built-in foam tip, so you don't ever have to worry about marring or damaging the finish of your wallpaper as well. Just like most decorative wallpapers, this is a reoccurring pattern that continuously goes approximately every 30 inches. That means the pattern is continuously repeating itself over and over and over again, so the real key element is just knowing exactly where the pattern starts at the very top of your wall, and then proceeding to line up the pattern accordingly as you make your way down. As you can see up close here, this paint spatula really does do an amazing job at flattening our wallpaper evenly without damaging the wallpaper, while also simultaneously making sure that we don't have any air bubbles that get caught up in our wallpaper. That is a thing that happens with vinyl print, so just another reason why we're working in small sections in order to avoid air bubbles along the way. In most circumstances, you will have a few areas where you're going to have to cut out 4 objects. In this case, we have an outlet, which I'm easily able to remove with a utility knife, but just be mindful of the fact that we're by electricity, and if you feel more comfortable, make sure you turn off the breaker prior to cutting. As I wrap up the remaining wallpaper installation portion of this project, I wanted to say a huge and special thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, Lowe's. They're a brand that I've personally used, known, and trusted for years, and the fact that they are actually diligently working with content creators like myself means a great deal to me, and one that I'm proud to be a part of. We wanted to team up on a project that was not only DIY friendly, but affordable and can be done year round. Lowe's is also a part of YouTube Shopping now, so many of these tools and materials that you find in this video can be found on YouTube Shopping, or of course at Lowe's stores or at lowes.com. Make sure you check them out, and as always, I'll make sure and have a link for each product and material in the description of this video. Now that we're on the final row of wallpaper, it is always smart to use a smaller section of wallpaper if that's what's required, because it's much easier to maneuver into those tight-knit areas. I cut a section that's approximately 6.5 inches wide, and the section that I need is only 6 inches wide. So this should be plenty of excess to account for overlap as I'm applying this final seam. As I've done continuously, I am just trying to line up the pattern accordingly on the one side and then pushing it smooth to the opposite side with my texturing paint spatula. And this is again where this tool comes in quite nicely, because I'm able to get into those very tight-knit areas around door, closet trim, and so forth. This is literally pushing the wallpaper perfectly into position, and once fully applied and in position, I can then come back around with my utility blade and remove all the excess wallpaper cleanly and precisely. In this application, I am using a break-off utility blade, which means I can literally break off the segments of blade to get a fresh blade ready to go. That is important when it comes to wallpaper, because a very clean, very sharp blade is key when having very crisp lines across the ceiling and the sides of the wall. If you just wanted cool wallpaper, well, we did install cool wallpaper, but we need to spice this wall up even more, because this wallpaper is just not enough for my son's bedroom. We're going to be incorporating wood trim across the front of this wallpaper to have a nice, fun, aesthetic look. But in order to do so, I do want to double check and make sure I know exactly where all the stud placements are, and a magnetic stud finder makes it very easy to do so. There are obviously numerous wood options available at my local Lowe's, but I found that this 1x4 by 8 foot long select pine was the perfect product for this project. Off the shelf, this material is quite smooth, but I wanted to give it a little extra love, so I took a sanding block with 300 grit sandpaper and sanded 2 sides along with the front face. Once all 3 sides are sanded down, it's now time for finish, and for this project, I'm going with a wax base finish. There are obviously copious other options to choose from when it comes to finishing, but I find that a wax is just a nice natural color and just emphasizes the beauty of the wood naturally, and that's really what I'm looking for in this type of application, where the real visual star of the show is the wallpaper, and this is going to be just more of a fun accent wall that blends and complements the wallpaper nicely. I could have left the existing base here, but I felt like it was going to be a bit of an eyesore, and I actually might rip out all this base in this room eventually, but till then I figured that having the same aesthetic look between the base and the accent wall would be best, so I installed this select pine as the wall base itself, and once that was installed, it's time for an aesthetic look. Now, before I took on this endeavor, I did know the general scheme of what I wanted to build and create, but I didn't know the exact style that would match and complement this room best. So I always suggest doing some creative fun runs and designs prior to actually being out in the field, which I did do. Figure out which one speaks to you the most and go with it. There might be a few changes along the way, but that's okay.
So what I'm planning on doing is making a cool mountainous design over here, but realizing that the angle to get this to work needs to be raised up a bit. I'm going to just make a mark and see what that angle is. Now I already know this side of my chop saw can only go to 50 degrees, but on this side I can go up to 60. So I'm gonna have to go all the way over this direction, and I'm gonna set it at 57 degrees. And even though it's the opposite direction, I'm just gonna flip it over and cut that side as needed. I can always sand it off to a finish later. That's 57 degrees.
And 90 minus 57 is 33. So I go to 1, 2, 3. For those of you who didn't know this already, this is actually called a complementary angle that adds up to 90 degrees. I'm going to fabricate all these pieces of wood as a mirror image of each other from one side to the other, and because we're working off of the wall base, which is a flat continuous surface for our trim to hit, that means cutting one side at 57 degrees and the other side at 33 degrees will now equal 90 degrees, and that will give us the perfect triangle that we are looking for, while simultaneously butting up perfectly at the very bottom of our base. Once our trim is tacked to the top and bottom, I then grab my laser level and line up my laser level with my tape markings to determine exactly where my stud placements are. This will guarantee that you have as much structural support as you possibly could get in this type of application. I will also kindly note that I'm using 16 gauge 2.5 inch long nails for plenty of structurability. The other nice thing when working with complementary angles is that you can still use these measurements in order to distinguish further cuts without having to figure out every single angle of each cut. That's why I'm making my first cut at 57 degrees, but I'm also making my second cut at a true 90 degree angle, because my design is incorporating perpendicular intersections between the large triangle in the very center of our wall and these smaller cross sections that are coming off of it. In order to make congruent center triangles that line up appropriately the very first time, again, the laser level comes in extremely handy. I'm cutting these angles exactly the same as I did previously, one at 57 degrees and one at 33 degrees, but then lining up my laser level with the very center of the triangle right above this smaller one. Once positioned correctly, I then nail it in place and move on to the next triangle. Now this really is the fun creative endeavor portion of this project, because whatever you want this design to be, make it happen, because you can be extremely creative and unique with this type of pattern structure. Me personally, I wanted a bit of consistency in the dead center of this room, which is why I made our large triangles very congruent and straightforward. On the outside of our large triangle, I didn't feel like the spacing had to be exactly the same, but I did want to make sure it's fully mirrored from one side to the other. A nice thing to have on hand when installing is to have some type of speed square or carpenter square on you, just to guarantee that you have that proper 90 degree angle that you're desiring, and if that's consistent over this entire area, there's not going to be any eyesores in the end. At a certain point, I did realize that all I had to do is place a mark on my large triangle indicating where exactly I wanted that perpendicular piece of trim to stick out from. Once I had that mark, I could then place a mark on the piece of trim I need to cut down to, and that gives me the perfect length needed for each section. This is a very nice and straightforward method, along with a time saver in the end, because less measuring. As I was cutting all these pieces, I did end up with a few more sizable pieces of scrap, which I then turned into pieces on the accent wall because they fit in perfectly into the small corners and crevices of our accent wall. So just use this as a helpful, friendly reminder to not waste those pieces of scrap, because they actually might come in handy at the tail end of the project. But with our last few pieces of our trim in place and our electrical outlets retrimmed, the only thing left to do is to fill a few of these nail holes. Now, the nail holes themselves are just going to be filled with a mixture of sawdust from the wood itself and some wood glue. Simple as that. Mix it up, then fill those holes and wipe it down with a wet, clean cloth. This method doesn't always give you the absolute perfect grain structure and match, but it does do a very good job considering that it's just sawdust from the existing wood. But with all those holes fully filled, I'm proud to say that we are done. I really do love testing the boundaries and being creative with these accent walls. I've done a number for my daughter's room, so might as well step it up with my son's room in a different creative way. And I honestly think he likes it, but you be the judge.
You like it? Okay, troublemaker. Now I must say, no matter who this room is for, I say it's one truly beautiful, sexy beast.